So just very briefly, I'm an attorney with Royce Law Firm. We've co-sponsored this event and we work with Vator. And just really pleased to be here and see everyone and be a part of this. I'm based in our firm's Santa Monica office. I'm helping our firm grow the market in Los Angeles and Orange County. And we specialize in venture capital, startups, and middle market companies. And I'm just happy also to thank you, panelists, and for your interviews beforehand. Great to meet you in person. And we'd like to have you introduce yourselves and your firm and mention your firm philosophy.
So if you go back to the history of Clare-Perkins with our first fund in 1973, one of our first and early winners was Genentech. So we've had a long history of both healthcare investing as well as digital investing. On our digital side, Google, Amazon. And then on our digital health side, we were investors in Teladoc. I sit on boards like Livongo and Lumeris that I think are really pertinent to this discussion, and it's great to be here.
Hi everybody, Rick Moss. I'm a founder and managing director of Better Ventures. Oh, you want this? Is that working? Can you hear me? Okay, it's on. I'm Rick Moss. I'm a founder and managing director of Better Ventures. We're a seed fund. I'm probably the earliest stage investor on this panel. We invest at the seed and pre-seed stage. We're based in Oakland. We invest at the intersection of technology and social and environmental impact. So we do health, primarily digital health. We also do sustainability, like the transition to a clean energy economy. We do opportunity, like education and access to good work opportunity. And our investment thesis is that mission-driven entrepreneurs outperform. Do we have any mission-driven entrepreneurs in the audience here? Yeah, they care more, they're super passionate, and they will never stop until they succeed. And that's what we look for, and it's working. In the value-based care area and in health, we have a few companies that I'd put in that bucket. One is Iris Plans. It actually came to a Vator event just last spring and won. It's doing telehealth for advanced care planning in palliative care. We have a company called Echo Devices, which is affectionately known as Shazam for heartbeats, doing cardiac care, lowering the costs and improving the outcomes. And our most recent is a company called Apostrophe Health, which is a little like Collective Health, if you know that, and it's doing third-party administration for self-insured employers, trying to make the process simpler and easier for patients and lower costs and better outcomes.
Yeah, it's working. David Kim. I'm actually a physician by training and jumped over to the business world actually now quite a number of years ago. But I've been doing initially medical device investing, but soon it was pretty clear that technology and application in healthcare was gaining a lot of traction. And so I made a jump from investing world to an operating role at a healthcare software company that does now, a lot of people use the word artificial intelligence, but they actually did a lot of predictive analytics using large amount of data. and ran that company for about 4 years before now coming back into an investing role, but focused specifically on digital health. A fund that I'm managing is called Digitex Partners, and it was formed by an investment from Astellas, big pharma, as well as MPM Capital. And there's a pool of capital that we use to invest in early stage companies, Series A, seed, maybe some B. So I'm somewhere between Rick and Lynn and Emily. Unfortunately, I can't talk about home runs because we started only about a year ago. But since then, we've made 4 investments, and 3 that I could talk about because the 4th one was just invested last Friday. So can't talk about that one yet. But we're investors in a company called Savonics, which does neurocognitive assessments, but on a mobile platform. So historically, that's been done on a paper-based test that was proctored by neuropsychologists, and usually takes hours, potentially even days, if you have to take it, time in between. But now it's actually, many of you guys have iPads or other tablets. This could be done in 30 to 40 minutes, and you have a battery of about 8 different tests to assess your neurocognitive status. That was one. We have another company called Sensoplex. For those people who have seen, people with movement disorders, whether it is through Parkinson's disease or, even muscular MS. You have situations where you want to see how well they're moving around, and even activities of daily living. People with a lot of chronic diseases have just difficulty getting around, congestive heart failure, and etc. This technology allows you to get really accurate assessment of movements, but also just a general overall sense of how much movement and the granular movement that you have throughout the day. And the last one that I could actually talk about is a company called Juji, which does personality assessment through digital data. And they've actually created a very smart chatbot so that when you have this interaction through this chatbot, you could actually assess your personality after about 1,000 words. And they are used in not only human resources, but now moving towards the clinical care area. So trying to assess who's the best personality that would for caregivers, or who's likely to be successful in like a drug rehab treatment.
Thank you. So I'm going to jumpstart with a question that I have for I'm going to begin with Emily because you just arrived, so we're going to dive on to you. So what is important for you in investment perspective that is driving the value based, and truly what are the basic ingredients that you see in any of the startups that come to pitch to you? That's driving value.
So I think that there's just things about investing in businesses, and then there's things investing about healthcare businesses, and then there's nuances of the market they're going after. But first and foremost, it's about, I say we invest in companies, but companies are built by people. And so what's really critical in the early stages, and 90% of our investments are in the Series A, is that we're backing a team that we believe is mission-driven, that's doing it for the right reasons, and has the grit and the motivation that's going to be persistent. That's always true of any kind of company, but in healthcare, it's particularly true because this is a slog. You don't get a lot of great reinforcement early on. So making sure that the individuals who are starting these businesses have what it takes to be able to go through those cycles is really, really important. So we spend a lot of time really understanding what motivated them, what drives them, how do they define success, because that's the key component to any successful business, but particularly in the sector. And then when we start to get beyond that and we get excited about it, the markets and the value-based, when I first started investing in healthcare, I've never been in an environment where there's more acronyms, in my life. You can literally, one of the investments I'm involved with has Charlie Cheever on the board, who's brilliant, but he was just I need a glossary. You guys, I can tell you how to build technology, but I need the glossary of what the hell you guys are talking about. And I think one of the challenges is that the real value of healthcare is often hidden behind a lot of these kind of acronyms or policy changes. And so what I said to you is, I think one of the things I really am excited about, what I want, is to see it's not driven by a policy incentive, but a business imperative. right? And I think a lot of, if you look at what's happened with EHRs or others, they were driven by policy incentives that weren't like you got reimbursed, they felt like someone did it, but then no one uses it. No one really cared. And so when we're trying to line it, there's things that go into value-based care or taking on risk, and there's lots of different definitions. But is there a business imperative? Is there a reason that people are going to do it that doesn't need to be subsidized, that doesn't need to be regulated or forced upon them? It's not to say you can't appreciate and recognize that ecosystem, but you have to have something that's beyond it to believe this is going to build a big business.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Emily says. I actually believe in the policy. I do like when there are carrots and sticks, because another thing about healthcare, which I think Emily was intonating, is that nothing happens quickly. And I think policy can help things go a bit more quickly, and then we can all argue about, is it the right direction or not? So I do think it at least aligns in an industry where there is a very complex ecosystem. You move left, someone else moves right, someone else moves left, right, and you really have to understand the ecosystem and the chain. And so when there is at least a policy movement, I think having those carrots and sticks is helpful. But I think Emily says at the core is absolutely right, is that there has to be a great business imperative. You have to be, if you're going after providers, payers, employers, the one or top two priorities, because otherwise you are lost in the mix of everything else. And we all know that, you know, things take, and you think of business cycles, you know, 12 to 18 months at least for some of these large players. So we see that. And then the ability to have a scalable solution. You know, I never say that technology is the end goal. I never think about, you know, people say, what do you think about AI? And I go, well, I think that's the wrong question inherently. What's the business problem? What is the solution? What's the user need here? And then how is technology enabling that to happen? And so sometimes I think, especially in the Valley, we tend to think about technology. And I think especially in healthcare, you really have to be thinking about business model and user need, and then how does technology wrap around that, and how can you do it in a scalable way? You know, I do not believe that technology will solve all, and, you know, we will always have doctors, and we will have service models. You know, I think about, and I see an individual from Livongo Health, which Emily and I are on the board of, but that is a beautiful example of hardware, software, and services tightly integrated in a unique solution that solves all of those layers. And I think you're going to see that it's hardware, software, or software and services is what I tend to see in healthcare, because, you know, this is not, again, not a sector or space that moves quickly, is not ready to best of breed solution stack, as I call it. You have to serve up ready-made, tailored solutions immediately, and that usually means a lot of layers, again, hardware, software, services.
I think we're interested in value-based care in particular because, you know, it has the potential to be a big societal shift that's meaningful and with lots of opportunity. All of us as investors look for these shifts, you know, the shift to mobile computing, the shift to the internet, the sequencing of the genome, the shift to electric cars, on and on, shift to clean energy. And, you know, value-based care has the potential to be one of those shifts. We have a system built on volume, and it could shift to a system built on value, and it would have profound implications. And we all kind of look for those kind of things that may be in the early stages of happening, so that we can, you know, help some of the innovators make it happen and capitalize on it. So that's a big reason we're excited about it. In terms of what we look for, I think, you know, the more we do it, the more we realize that aligning all the different interests and all the different parties is really hard and important. And so we look for people who have the experience and the tenacity to align payers and providers and physicians and patients and all of their different, both personal and economic interests, because it's really hard. And I would echo what Emily said. You know, one of our founding CEOs is a ultramarathon runner, or whatever you call them. You know, she'll ride her bike for 100 miles and run a marathon and swim 10 miles or whatever it is. And it's not a bad analogy, because I think that's what it takes to hear no over and over again, or you can't do that and then muscle your way through.
I don't know how much more I could add to what's been said already. I think that the only thing I could say is that people with domain knowledge is really important to me when I have a conversation with an entrepreneur. It's because they're positioned to see some of the business cases, some of the unmet needs, and some of the problems that just need to be solved, whether it is in a, especially in a value case situations where you're looking for efficiencies, you're looking for those things that, it's like, why are people doing this? That clearly is not leading to better clinical outcomes. Since they live that problem on a daily basis, they have a better idea of how to best address it. And that's one of the things that I usually like to have conversations around. And I totally agree that it's not, investing in the technology per se. I'm trying to invest in that solution to the problem that's being affecting people on a daily basis. And if it includes AI, or if it includes, really interesting diagnostics, if it includes, algorithms, great. But it is actually, I think it starts with that, understanding what the issues are. And typically people who, live it on a daily basis, they have a pretty good idea.
Fantastic. And I would like to urge, folks who are sitting in the seats to also jump in if you have a question while we're having this discussion. That'd be great. I just have a follow-up to this. In the Valley, investment needs a 10x return in 18 months. I'm inflating the expectation at this point, but the need of value-based is urgent. It's not that it's going to be tomorrow or it's going to be 3 years later, but it's needed now. How patient are you with your startups or innovations that you're backing, that you could give them more time? And when do you actually give them more time? What stage or what kinds of solutions that we are patient?
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think in healthcare, I think what's kind of said already, you have to be patient. And it's not because, it's not like the consumer world where you got really interesting technology or a game that people just adopt overnight. I mean, there are, the idiosyncrasies of healthcare that you have to deal with, whether it is like, nurses on an ICU floor that have done these things in the same way for the last 10 years that you have to win over before a new technology could be adopted, or that, the paper-based system that an outside clinic's been using for the last 10 years, because they've always done that. I mean, why do people still use faxes? But it's just that there are things that, that you have to deal with in healthcare, and you have to be, I mean, that's one of the things about understanding the problem is that it says that you have to be patient, because if your expectation is that they are going to provide 10x in 18 months, and I would never see that on an investment memo, because if I do, I'll just laugh at it. But it's because it just won't happen. You just got to be more patient, understanding that you have to build in that adoption period. It's great, if we could have validated technologies that we can invest right away that could be adopted immediately. But whether it is getting through the 3 or 4 different committees within a hospital, or even especially a payer, you have to convince 10 different people that this is actually worthwhile. It's patience is required.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to change that. I'm never patient, and I don't think any of our entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial teams are ever patient, but I think I am pragmatic. So nothing is ever fast enough or otherwise. And I think our entrepreneurs feel that too, especially, I would say, and not to be too black and white about this, but just for the sake of analogy, is that even our digital entrepreneurs who have come into the digital health space are just always floored at how long everything takes. So we're never, again, I don't think we like to be patient. We are relentless, I think, with our entrepreneurs and wanting to scale our businesses quickly. But I think we're very pragmatic on laser-like focus. So again, we believe that really digital health is B2B2C. And in that type of model, you have to have laser-like focus on your solution, the value that you're bringing to strategics, if it's, again, payer, providers, employers. You have to be laser-like in your targeting of who's really moving in those various spaces. To say we go after providers is like, such a broad term, and who are you really going to go after? Who's really making steps? You have to know that. And your investing team and the leadership team, you should be working together on that. That should be an everyday, scale the mountaintop together, find the right players that are really moving in this space. And I think we're in a world of a different place than 2 years ago, but still, sometimes it just doesn't feel fast enough. But I think if you, again, recognize the market that we're in, B2B2C, laser-like focus on the solution, your use case, and your value, relentlessly target the right customers who are moving forward, I think you can be pragmatic and you can build in a great way, but, always, like I said, we're just impatient and always living that way because at some point, and I always say with a lot of these strategics, they never say yes, but they never say no. And, that's the worst to be in. And for entrepreneurs, don't even get to that point. Cut bait, move on, and move to the next player that really is going to move forward. And so, those are the kinds of things that I think you really have to think about pragmatically and to build a business.
I would agree with much of what's been said. I think we're looking for entrepreneurs who can't pronounce patient because that's kind of what gets you from point A to point B is a sense of urgency. In the social impact world, I think we have a special relationship with this word patience because there's sort of a lot of talk about how some problems just take a long time to solve. Hunger, and clean energy and the drug crisis, right, the opioid crisis. You don't just wake up and solve these problems overnight. And so there's a class of entrepreneur and investor who's kind of seeking longer-term solutions and longer-term sort of investment vehicles. But I think, just to take the opposite view and point out the obvious on the opposite is that there's patience is needed in certain hard-to-solve problems, but at the same time, deadlines and a sense of urgency tends to focus minds. Anyone ever had a final exam or a paper due or a conference where they had to announce something at a conference? Sometimes we'll have people invent conferences so that they can have something to announce and get the product launched. And in venture capital, there's a sort of an inherent 18-month cycle. And in that 18 months, or about that much, between 12 and 24, you have to deliver something amazing one way or the other. And so, and then if you don't, then we as investors have pressure on our ability to hit the returns we've kind of signed up for, just like the entrepreneurs do. And then I think entrepreneurs who need more time end up sometimes raising money on less favorable terms, and sometimes their common equity stake can start to melt, as it were. And you can lose momentum, and it becomes harder and harder. And you can always kind of pull something off at the last minute, but there's something to be said for going fast and just making it happen. And I think the community is a little bit unforgiving about pauses and slowdowns. And that said, we all want to be patient. And I think there's a certain class of investor who can be more patient. And I think you need to just be careful when you're choosing your who you work with.
Yeah, that was the direction I was going to take this, which is we're all investors, which means we need a return on capital, right? But different investors have different thresholds and they have different time frames. And one of the most important decisions that you as entrepreneurs will make is who you're raising money from and really understanding what they're expecting. So my husband has a saying that I love, which is happiness equals reality minus expectations. And if your expectations are way out of whack versus reality, you end up having to. I think this is really important for you to appreciate. And Lynn and I have talked about this because we're in a little bit of a different beast because we're on platforms that the dollars that we're investing are fixed, right? We're investing out of a fund. And so while we're not competing, there is a certain amount of capital that's going to go into companies. And so if we're coming in and saying, well, our stuff is going to take 12 to 15 years and might be worth $200 million, and there's something that comes in and says it's going to take 7 to 10 years and it's going to be worth $5 billion, guess where you're going to put all your money, right? So understanding the investor and understanding what their expectations are, I see a lot of wonderful businesses in healthcare that I think are great. I can't justify them to my partners because they don't fit the framework in which we invest. Does not mean they're not great businesses. It just means that I have to actually make a case for how this stuff works and over what time. So understanding that and really figuring out and make sure that you're aligned with your investors is going to be one of the most important decisions you make, because if you sell a big story and think it's okay, I'll figure it out later, that's a recipe for disaster. In general, all investors, the fund cycles are 10 years. Sometimes they last a little bit longer, but there is this clock. There's the clock in terms of when we're looking for returns, and there's the clock in terms of when you're looking for those milestones of how you actually raise capital. I think one of the challenges is consumer can go substantially. It's binary. People really adopt it or not, and that's why you see such huge valuation creation really quickly. The staying power becomes big challenges. So you see companies raise a ton of money, and then they go bust because they no longer are cool. SaaS, you can see certain kind of cycles of adoption. I think healthcare, and I've been arguing this with my partners, and we're starting to talk, it's more of a step function. You get one customer, you prove it out, and then you start to see a bigger step function, and then you do another, and so it's a different model, but there's still big levels where you can actually start to see that value creation. You need to have assumptions about what that's going to be for your business and hold yourself accountable to that. Because I think on the flip side, we all are saying it's a slog and it's hard, but when I hear the entrepreneurs say it's just hard, that isn't acceptable. Right? We have to have a timeline that we're all agreed to, and we have to have an understanding of when we're going to be able to hold ourselves accountable. This is working or this isn't working.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to refine my comments, it's not that, again, I think we think like entrepreneurs, nothing's ever quick enough, but what I mean by that is in healthcare, you have to be very smart about what you're going after, whom you're going after it with, and being laser-like in the resources, because there's a lot of confusion in the market. There's a lot of players that are dipping their toe in the water but not really acting, right? So you just have to be really smart from the get-go. Get the right investors who know this space, get the right team around you, have that laser-like, focus on the product and the value proposition and the commercialization from like seed stage, right? And so that's really what I mean. That's making the right choices, doing your homework, and being agile and iterating very quickly to find if it's product market fit or otherwise. And that's what I mean. And just, this has to, I think, eventually, you work with your investors and your leadership teams to do this. And again, you'll persevere.
One issue that I think that entrepreneurs are really going to face, especially at the early stage, is you want to be, as Lynn said, laser focused, but at the same time you have this desire to create as big of a market as possible, to see how many different use cases can you actually put your technology into, so that you could actually go in your pitch deck and say, well, we're going to look at a $10 billion overall market. So it's one of those things that it's going to be a hard decision, because ultimately, I think as investors, we want all of the above. We want that, how you're going to dominate a single sector, but you could use your technology for everything as well. So, but you have limited resources and limited time to actually prove this out. And I think that, this is where you do have to be really actually thoughtful and work with, not only with your, team, but also with investors about what kind of company you want to build out as you get these funding, because you really do have only about 12 to 18 months to, prove out, before you have to go and now again raise more money and say, hey, this is what we accomplished over the last year or 18 months.
Sorry, just one other quick thing. We're all probably GPs with general partnerships with limited partner investors and timelines. There's a whole class of investors out there that don't have that, typically known as family offices. So these are the Gates, the Schmidts, the Cases, et cetera, the Scholes, and they essentially have their own money, and they can invest it as they see fit, and they can be infinitely patient if they want to. But I wouldn't necessarily wish working on that kind of a format on everyone, because there's something to having sort of a deadline and a strong motivator to force you to sort of make a certain accomplishment in a certain time frame.
So given that value-based care is not if but when is really the question, are there any criteria that you can identify for flexibility, for a company to thrive and grow in a value-based care environment?
I think I mentioned this before. There are components of value-based care that, that could fit into, if you want to take a level down. One of the things that I really look for is, how do you create efficiencies? A scalable product that is, provides efficiency in this very, I would say, inefficient market of healthcare. And that, hopefully, in the long run, will lead to decrease in cost of delivery of the healthcare. So I look for technologies that, that tackle some of these problems. Savonics is one example. I mean, I don't know if anyone has actually gone through a formal neuropsych eval, but it actually could cost thousands of dollars. And it could take hours because in order to do a paper-based test, you need some, and there's only 1,000 actually certified neuropsychologists in the United States. I didn't really know that until this particular deal, but they are paid a lot of money to help you proctor through these neurocognitive tests. I mean, why do you need someone who's that highly paid to do a stopwatch so that they could turn to the next page of that particular test? I mean, there are tablets in which that the information could be like displayed on an accurate basis. The timing is already there. So these are some of the inefficiencies that you see out there that, why do you need to spend so much on these type of, requirements? And so in a value-based solution, that's definitely, at the end of the day, hopefully this will lead to improved quality, but also decrease time and cost to actually deliver the whatever service that you're looking for. And that should lead to, hopefully, better value-based care.
So this is value-based care model panel, and Rick, you mentioned that this is a huge shift. As I mentioned earlier, this is a paradigmatic model. I mean, we're going from volume-based, fee-based to value-based. So as you look at your startup, and I know a lot of startups here are trying to figure out what is a good business model that is value-based. So as you work with your companies, what are some of the new value-based models that you've seen that have worked, that have scaled, and what are those that haven't?
Yeah, no, I don't know. So I think that there's a nuance I kind of want to, value-based is a way of thinking about your business, right, and a way of actually contracting. It is not itself like a business, right? It's a way, it's a business model. And for most of the entities in this ecosystem, they're just doing components of their business that are value-based. So one of the big challenges, I think, is that you think about it as this idea, it's like value-based care, but it's actually they're going to test it. It's bundled payments or centers of excellence, or there's a lot of these kind of programs that have already existed where you're just trying to align, that there's an outcome that you get a fixed payment for, right? And you get penalized if you don't have the quality. And so that's the way that I kind of think about it as you've done these test cases, and then people are going to start taking on more and more risk where they're associated with that. Where do you see different entities in the ecosystem making those business model changes, and then how do I enter into that ecosystem? And so I think what you're hearing from a little bit of the kind of pause as the reaction to these questions is that that's evolving right now, and honestly it's been a little bit rough. I'd never thought they'd touch bundle payments. I mean, when he started touching bundle payments, I was like, oh God, I'm giving up for a year on this. That's the obvious one. These are Republican concepts. So the policy is really in mix, but they've been promoting bundled payments, and just recently they've started to say that they might move away from that. So I think that what we have to do is actually look for providers that I'm saying, going back to this business imperative, that are taking populations on risk, and they're trying to figure out what are the needs that they have. And I'm more interested in looking at what am I seeing in the customer base and who's writing checks where, why, than I am about whether or not they're calling it value-based or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd say the same thing, is that, or maybe a different way, is that I look for companies with solutions that are going to increase quality, reduce costs, right, but are not predicated upon commercializing in an ACO model or a bundle payment model per se. So I think you have to achieve those goals because that is ultimately where healthcare is going. But you don't want to risk your commercialization model on the fact that, you know, value-based care models will overtake fee-for-service in the next 2 years, or otherwise you don't have a commercialization strategy. So that's how I would address that.
I would let's see. I would bucket what's working into carrots and sticks and other. I guess on the carrot front, I think that's what's working best first because it's easiest to sort of share in the upside. So shared savings is starting to work, and bundled procedures like joint replacement is working with some of our startups. Those are not as hard to do as some of the things that we know we need. In terms of stick, I think, you know, longer term, we need to do things like full financial sharing of both upside and downside between parties, and possibly things like global capitation. These are like much harder, and I think further out, and I'm not yet seeing those working. And then in terms of other, I'm seeing glimmers of hope in essentially disambiguating all of the data that's coming into and out of our various medical record systems. I think this was alluded to earlier. You know, we've spent decades putting our records into an electronic format, and now we have data coming at us from every direction. It's like going through a car wash with the top down or something. There's just data flying everywhere, and if you're a doctor, you're getting all these reports, but you don't know what to do with them, and they don't necessarily make sense. And we're starting to see companies that are disambiguating the different elements of data so that people know what to do and can take action. Like, for instance, in the case of readmissions, if a readmission rate is up, there are like 4 or 5 parties kind of involved in that, right? So you can tell someone your readmission rates are up, you know, pay attention, right? And they'll say, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. I'm a doctor, and there are these non-doctor providers involved. There's the payer, there's the facility, there's the provider. They all have policies that affected this, and it's not my fault. And so I think one glimmer of hope we're seeing is that companies are starting to tease apart this data and say to a doctor, look, you had a patient come in after just 2 days ago, and here's what you can do to prevent that. And so I think that's another thing that's just starting to work.
Just quickly to follow on that, I think one of the things that is really interesting is what do you do with the data, because there is a lot of data, and it's ultimately, I think, you know, there are a number of companies that are doing, now people are using the word artificial intelligence, but really, let's say predictive analytics, taking a large amount of data that could actually start to predict, you know, some kind of an outcome. And if you have that insight, then perhaps you can do interventions that will, you know, do really well. But one of the things that is clear is that whether it is the value-based or even a fee-for-service, it's with all this information, you know, how can you get in front of it? How can you know, start to make prediction about where things are going? And even, you know, just assessment of quality, you know, so I had the fortune or the misfortune of actually working to find all the data that goes into a quality measure for an ACO. It's a lot of stuff, and just needing the underlying technology to make, you know, heads or tails out of it, to automate it, it's actually a lot of work. And so there are opportunities even within whatever, you know, system that you want to do if you want to actually take data and do something really interesting with it.
So I wanted to follow on what Emily said, because it's kind of a real problem we have. Not every geographical area that HP has an employee, that we have ACOs, or we have a value-based, either in the infancy or the growth or the journey map that we call it. So it seems like we could, you know, direct contract regardless of if they are defined to be value-based or not.
Yeah.
And that, you know, purchasers of health could drive this change, creating that ecosystem.
This is, I mean, collective health, others are trying to, this has been the argument, and I think in theory, it sounds so compelling, right? Which makes a ton of sense. Like, let's just do direct contracting with underlying providers and tie ourselves with the upside and the downside. And maybe eventually we'll get there where the provider systems are capable of doing this. The challenge is, it's like the management of that and the amount of overhead on both sides for you as an organization, as well as what would require on the provider side, that actually becomes a pretty small subset of employers that are big enough, sophisticated enough, and even willing to take it on. So that's the challenge of like really aligning all of these incentives. I'm much more interested in versus like value-based networks and thinking about true narrow networks where you can carve out certain areas and align that and think about how, there's like the ways of saying, I want to just make everything value-based care across all of my healthcare. That's going to be really, really hard. Are there certain kinds of deconstruction of the healthcare where you can look at layers that make a lot of sense, that don't require you to be with your physical physician, that don't require that pre-existing relationship, where you can think about realigning the economic incentives? I personally believe those are going to be the more scalable and interesting models, and that takes some of the management layer off of your headache. But yeah, so I've spent so much time, and I'm such a believer in that concept that I just don't think is a venture investment time frame, and I'm not yet seeing the momentum there.
Answer for you.
I mean, it's something that we've thought a lot about, and I know, I mean, Emily and I we want to happen, and it's, you know, and like I said, it's the provider side, just knowing that they can do that well. I mean, we've seen, we won't name names, but there are many contracts that you can see from ACOs that have not performed well. So you really have to understand and have baby steps. Like when we think about
BPCI, before bundle payments, right? It was a way for providers to dip their toe into something when something's not mandatory, it's participatory, and you have conveners to help you, and there are certain things, right, that help you on this journey before you really go at risk. And I'd say there are a few providers that do that very well today. And then on the employer side, I think it's just very difficult. It's to work your own contracts. I mean, you really need a large team. And again, now you're getting into Fortune 100, right, with large teams that'll direct contract, which will negotiate. Now there are some payers who will also do that for you, but then you insert, you know, another player into the mix. And I just think, I'd like to think that, I think employers have a great responsibility as well as empowerment to change a lot of healthcare. I think we have to be pragmatic about where they're going to have that change. And I think this is for the like 1% of employers, of which I was just sitting with Boeing yesterday and Walmart, who are doing this very well. But those, again, are Fortune kind of 100 companies with large teams and the know-how, and have baby stepped into this over time.
I'll just throw out that one of our companies was inspired by the success story of Rosen Hotels. Have you guys heard about this? It's sort of like a privately owned hotel chain in Florida, and
Orlando.
Okay, they managed to kind of implement employer self-insurance extraordinarily well and achieved somewhat staggering results. And they put clinics on site. They provided free prescription drugs on site for all their employees. They even went beyond that and provided, you know, college education to their employees with the savings from the from what they did. And it was an inspiration for why one of our companies started, Apostrophe Health, was that they realized that that doing that is a staggering task, and setting up all those direct relationships and doing that all yourself is impossible. And anyone who wants to self-insure is just faced with this wall of choices and information. And so their goal was to try to sort of essentially institutionalize those best practices and try to repeat them. But I think we're all agreeing that it's really hard to try to go direct and set it all up yourself.
I'm going to pass. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. I have a question about how feasible this is actually for startups to really focus on. Everybody talks about, you talk about it, driving up quality, driving down costs. Even in DC, everybody would agree to that statement, as long as it stays really general. But then when it comes to precision health, which is sort of the ultimate form of driving up quality and lowering costs, which is preventing disease from the beginning or treating it really early, I have yet to see the first startup that is not complaining, that's in that area, that can tell me that they have a business model that actually gets them rewarded for something that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. In other words, you have to pay them for something that didn't happen. And there's no model for that as far as I know, but I would love to hear whether you have seen any models that are going and sort of cracking the nut of getting paid for something that didn't happen, because it would be a breakthrough. Because there's so many people working on precision health, but very few people make money.
Well, so for precision health, ultimately is when you do the whatever initial test and when you see a financial outcome, it could be pretty long depending on what disease process. So I think that if you want to take population management as kind of an end result of precision health, I mean, that's one of the reasons why people are going after diabetes, because if you have certain interventions, you may actually be closer to a financial outcome than you do with certain, let's say, congenital heart disease, where you're trying to, diagnose somebody at age 5 when they actually start to show symptoms at age 25. I mean, that's kind of the extremes of, 2 examples, but it's unfortunately, a lot of innovation and the business solutions are driven by how quickly you're going to get to a financial return. And so with precision health, I think that, the idea is big, and I think that people are, especially whether it's, companion diagnostics or there's certain diagnoses for, very curable diseases that you're going to, where things are going. But this is another situations where it may not be in purview a lot of the investors. Some investors are going to look in the long run because the market is pretty big, and that's kind of true with like biotech. But other investors, they may be looking for revenues in 2 years, and that may not happen for precision, medicine.
We do see that money did flow towards Grail, for example,
Right.
or now 23andMe, who knows what they're doing under the
Yeah,
hood.
investments.
Yes,
Right,
yeah.
investments, but not Grail is. I mean, 900 million, and we'll see what comes out in 5 to 10 years, right? Because they're really heavily science-based, and whether it's Grail or some of the other, I would say, really big investments, they're doing a lot of early-stage research, but I don't think they're going to be close to revenues in the near term.
We have 1 more minute, and there's a question.
Let me really quickly, I just wanted to address that point, and then we'll get to this. This is kind of, we need to have step 1 and then step 2, then step 3. And step 1 is, can we manage populations better? And then we get to personalized medicine in the way that you're saying. And I think we are managing populations better in terms of this step 1 of this evolution. In that, I think about Livongo, we are reducing ED visits, right? By helping patients manage their diabetes well. There are things that we are avoiding, right, because of that, and we have an ROI because of that. So, and Emily was talking about Omada as well. So I think we have that. Now, getting down to that personalized approach for that individual, I think we're going to get there eventually, but I do think that is happening now when we are taking shared savings or, upside or risk-based contracts. Many of our companies actually do that today to prove that. Sorry, but go ahead, sir.
Thanks. Actually, it's not a question. So, Derek, that was great. You know what? The insurance industry actually figured this out, where you get basically discounts when you don't smoke. You get discounts when you basically don't get in car accidents. So I think basically the way that you could inspire at HP is figure out how you could score your employees, give them effectively discounts by going through wellness plans. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I think that entrepreneurs have to just solve problems, right? I mean, we have to just build great products, solve problems. You can't care about the pricing model. I mean, I remember first time when I was at Apple years back, Steve Jobs told me we were trying to price the Apple IIc. And he said, screw pricing, doesn't matter. He says, you price it at the end, just create a great fucking product. And I think it's the same thing here, which is companies just have to create great products. But maybe that's where you guys come in, and you can create the incentives for employees to get behind the whole value.
And that's along those lines, in a way, that we do offer, for example, biometrics, and we do offer cancer screening throughout the year. We partner, we have Premise Health on site. We're giving on-site health care for 3 of our locations in which, we're detecting things early. Even the reporting goes out, what things we avoided, how many ER visits we avoided, how many patients who would have gone to a specialist we avoided. So that cost avoidance, direct and indirect, is important, and those are the things we are starting to see reports on and make business decisions based on that. So I think that shift from somebody who's paying or writing that big check is starting to happen. I just want to see more of that in the innovation field, in which we are starting to see more of prevention and not just damage control.
I also think it's important over what period of time. And I'm sorry, I know we're at, but like I think there are different people who are owning the risk at different periods of time, right? So like when you're young, it's on your parents' insurance. When you go, it's an employer. But that's very forward-thinking of you. I do a lot of work with large self-insured employers. So like now that I'm starting to see the turnover of my population, I'm interested in what it's going to save me money in a couple of years. I'm not really interested in what's going to save me money for a decade plus, because most of my employees aren't going to be here. It's not going to be my problem. It's past the buck, right? And so like Medicare is the one that you're seeing the most in for is Medicare populations, because at least you know once you have them, you got them for another 20 years. But it's really hard. I gotta say, it's like I make my kids brush their teeth. It's because I care about them, but I also really don't want to have to pay to go to the dentist and actually have to do cavities, right? Because it's my problem. But the challenge is like, you don't have that kind of alignment of incentives throughout the entire thing of health, and it's so variable and has multiple people. It's like the single payer, if you could just say, we're taking on this entire risk pool and we know we're gonna have to own those humans for the entire time, then I think you'd see a lot of that stuff take place and be much more interesting. But unfortunately, because of the misalignment of incentives across the different areas, people aren't willing to put that money forth. Color was invited to present to one of the groups I'm involved with, and they didn't want them. And the reason they didn't want them wasn't because it's not interesting. Sure, it's helpful if you know you have BRCA1 or not. What they had found is the couple people who had done it, the follow-on costs in their system, because they got freaked out, was every test, okay, it only cost me $1,200 for a test. I'm paying $4,000 per person that then wants to go and talk to their primary care or a specialist or everything, and I can't do anything about it. So that's interesting, but that's not the information. I don't want to take on the cost, even if it's going to fix something that could be happening 5-10 years, because they're probably not going to be my problem.
Yeah, Matt, you can talk. Oh gosh.
Well, Matt, you can talk.
No, but I love her drink, so we're really good friends.
Is that a brief question?
It's super brief. Thanks, I owe you that drink. But I guess the thing that's running through my mind as a doctor's daughter and an entrepreneur, and also now as a patient in some things, is you've got concierge medicine, which is absolutely 100% resistant to any little bit dip of their income, and not taking the insurances and things. And then you also have the pharmaceutical companies that are so very focused on being able to push their drugs to all of us that may or may not need them. So what I'm looking in an answer is, what are the emotional incentives? What are the higher good incentives to be able to talk to the folks whose livelihood is dependent on keeping us sick?
Could I comment on one thing? Not that I'm beholden to Astellas, but I would say that if you look at pharma overall, there's this whole trend for patient-centric care. That's one of the things that they've been all pushing. Definitely at Astellas, that's been something that I've been asked to help look at, because it may include some digital health stuff. But it's pretty clear that they see the tea leaf in that just selling pills is not going to be a sustainable business in the long run. That they really do believe that it is actually managing the patient in the long run. It may include having drugs as part of that overall management. So I would say that, whether they believe that value-based care is going to be the end result of everything, but they really, I think this area the push towards patient-centric care, and then overall, trying to provide the best care, I think that's kind of shared throughout, the healthcare system.
There is a lot of work in the PBM market that's starting to happen, in which the risk is starting to get into that discussion, and I think it would be very interesting to see how it pans out with the providers and the payers in general. All right. You have a question? Do we have time?
If there's one, but we probably need to cut to break.
So the panelists would be here, I believe, right? So you can come on over and you can ask them directly. I think that would be good. And so we can take a break now. We have about 20 minutes. 15.